Здравствуйте, welcome back to Russian 3 Poems and Paintings. Today is day 123, and we're starting again this multi-day unit on deverbals, which are extremely important, again, especially for reading formal Russian, but also in speech, right? Sometimes it's heard that, these things aren't really used in speech, right? Sometimes you hear that idea thrown around. That is totally untrue, right? I think it's ultimately really a mistake to even put that claim forward, right? So on the one hand, it's certainly true that you will see a lot of these in formal written Russian or informal spoken Russian. If someone's reading a speech, like something they would read off of a prepared text, of course you'll see these in great density. But a lot of these forms will be heard in everyday speech as well, especially certain types of these deverbals, right? So we'll talk more about that as we go through all the particular types. Um, at any rate, what do we mean by deverbals? Basically, a deverbal is any word that's derived from a verb, right? Deverbal. And we're going to cover today first adverbs, then adjectives, then nouns, right? So all three of these types of words can be derived from verbs. We're going to see how that happens. It's done so very regularly, very predictably in most cases. So this is something we can cover pretty nicely, pretty systematically. Um, and we'll see that most of these forms are actually not that difficult, with one major exception, which also happens, unfortunately, to be probably the most common deverbal used, including in everyday speech. Okay, more on that later. Okay, so the first thing to point out is that um, the difficulty here is producing these forms from verbs, right? How do we take a verb and derive all of these different deverbals from the given verb? Right, we're going to learn the rules for doing that. But it's very important to remember from the very beginning that once we go through that process, right, and say we have our adverb, we have our adjective, we have a noun that we produced from a verb, those new words are adverbs, adjectives, and nouns, just like any other adverb, adjective, or noun in the Russian language, right? So once we produce that form, there's nothing really that special about it, right? For example, a verbal adjective is going to take adjectival endings, right? The same endings we've seen for any other adjective, right? Verbal nouns, most of those are going to end up being special soft neuters, right? And they're gonna look like special soft neuters. They're gonna act like special soft neuters, right? Um, again, the only difficulty here is how to form them in the first place. Okay, let's look at a painting quickly. Another one by Vasnetsov on kind of a fairy tale theme, right? Spящая царевна, the sleeping princess or sleeping beauty, as we'd say in English, right? And that form spящая, you may be able to guess, especially given the translation, that that's related to spать, right? The verb for to sleep, which we've had. So spящий is a verbal adjective from spать. It means one who sleeps or sleeping. And here we're applying that verbal adjective to a feminine noun, tsarevna, and we get spящая царевна. Right? We could say, read the caption here, спящая царевна, то есть дочь царя, right? A царевна is the daughter of a tsar, a princess. Это царевна, которая спит вместе со всем своим царством, right? That's a princess who sleeps together with her entire kingdom. Все околдованы. Everyone is enchanted. Everyone has been enchanted. They've had a spell put on them. That form, also, околдованы, is a short form, PPP as we'll call it, perfect, past passive participle, past passive participle, sorry. PPP, we'll learn that form later. Может быть, вы знаете балет Tchaikovsky's «Спящая красавица». Perhaps you know the ballet, Tchaikovsky's ballet, The Sleeping Beauty. Okay, so spящая is a verbal adjective. Okay, so we'll get to that form later. Today we're kind of giving a general introduction to deverbals, and we're learning actually verbal adverbs today, which are fairly easy to cover. Okay, the one thing to note as we move forward is that these sorts of words in English are often very ambiguous. They often end in ing, and again, this is another instance where English is quite a bit more ambiguous than Russian here in terms of what part of speech are we dealing with, what's really going on here grammatically. Look at these examples with sleeping, right? Sleeping could be an adjective, an adverb, or a noun in English. And obviously, all of these words are related to the word sleep, right? To sleep. Sleep, by the way, can also be a noun all by itself in English. We have this habit of turning nouns into verbs and vice versa in English with no change to the form necessarily. And here again, we get these three different ing words: sleeping, uh, sleeping, right? Let a sleeping dog lie. Okay, there it's used as an adjective modifying dog. The child lay sleeping. How did it lay? How was it lying? Sleeping, right? Telling how. That's adverbial. And finally, I like sleeping late on Sundays. That's what's called a gerund in English, right? It's a noun. I like sleeping. Okay, so basically, I just put that out there to point out that we need to be a little bit careful moving from English to Russian here and vice versa when we're dealing with these deverbals, right? Again, in Russian, it's going to be crystal clear as to whether we're dealing with an adverb, an adjective, or a noun, because all of those words take different endings in Russian, as we know. Okay, so let's start with verbal adverbs, and here's our little master table. You see it's very straightforward here with the adverbs. Adjectives won't be quite this easy, by the way. For adverbs, we have imperfective and perfective verbal adverbs. That means that if we take any given pair, like читать, прочитать, right, an aspectual pair, we're going to get two adverbs from that, right? One from the imperfective and one from the perfective, and those are formed differently for the most part. Okay, so here we just have examples before we learn how to form them. Chitaya is an imperfective verbal adverb, and it means while reading, or better yet, while reading. Now we'll see that the while is often optional, and in fact, it would normally not be included in English. But again, it's one of those things that for learning purposes, in terms of comprehending the Russian, it's very nice to throw in that while because it makes very clear how this adverb is working in the Russian. We'll see an example here in just a moment. Okay, and finally, perfective, from the perfective прочитать, we get прочитав, having read. And here the having is really crucial. There's really no other way to translate this. Having read, прочитав. Okay, now what's the difference between these? Well, actually, first we should note these are adverbs. What does that mean in terms of the forms? It means that these will never change their form, like any adverb. Think like хорошо, right? Well, that never changes its form in Russian. And the reason for that is that it doesn't modify a noun, right? It's not going to change its case or its gender or anything to agree with the noun it's modifying because it's modifying a verb. Okay, now note this can be a little bit confusing. Look at the form chitaya, and we see that ending, aya, looks like a feminine adjectival ending, right? But that's just a coincidence, right? It's not. We'll see later that once we know all these forms, we would simply know that this could not possibly be a verbal adjective, right? The adjective would look different. It would have a different ending, a different suffix ahead of the adjectival ending. Okay, so you might want to circle that and just be on guard that just because we see aya doesn't necessarily mean it's an adjective, right? Because it could be one of these verbal adverbs, imperfective. Okay, so let's compare these two and compare the meaning. Она сидела в библиотеке, читая книгу. She was sitting in the library reading a book, or even better, while reading. Okay, because imperfective verbs describe action that is simultaneous, it's ongoing with the action of the verb it modifies. So look at the agreement, the arrow there, chitaya, which opens up a clause, right? Modifies the verb in the main clause, right? Она сидела, she was sitting in the library. How was she sitting? She was sitting while reading a book, right? And this adverb again kind of answers a how question, so to speak. Now, this is very important as once we start reading, we're going to see these deverbals everywhere. And in order to make sense of them, we need to be very clear about what we're looking at and what they're modifying, right? Now, this may seem overly simple with some of these examples in the textbook here, but we're looking at very simple examples. If you're looking at actual prose, you may see multiple clauses, multiple deverbals. And again, to understand the Russian, we've got to be very careful analyzing them. So adverbs, these verbal adverbs are going to be modifying verbs. Now, students are often tempted to say, chitaya modifies ana, right? Because it's telling what she's doing. Well, that's true in a certain sense, but strictly in terms of the grammar, that is not true, period, right? Chitaya is modifying the verb sidiela. It's telling us more about the sitting activity. How is she sitting? Well, while reading a book. Okay, so it's crucial to look at a form like chitaya, say, okay, that's an adverb. That means I'm looking for a verb in terms of figuring out what it's modifying. Then once we find the verb, we see that chitaya is imperfective, so it's describing an action that's simultaneously unfolding with the action of the main verb. Now compare that with a perfective verbal adverb. Прочитав книгу, она вышла из библиотеки. Having read the book, she left for the library. Okay, again, that's a verbal adverb. The form will never change. Its ending will never change. It's modifying a verb in the main clause. In this case, that's вышла, right? So we could say, well, how did she leave the library? Having read the book. Having read the book. And we see that perfective verbal adverbs, as we might expect, they describe completed action, right? They describe action that was completed prior to the action of the verb they modify. Right, so first she finished reading the book, and then she left the library. Having read the book completely, perfectively, right, she left the library. Okay, let's look at some examples here and just kind of passively analyze them, see if we can spot the verbal adverbs, and tell what they modify and practice translating them. Сидя за столом, они пили чай и разговаривали. Okay, we see our main verbs here, past tense. Они пили чай, разговаривали. They were drinking tea and conversing, talking. Okay, how are they doing those things? Сидя за столом, while sitting at the table, literally behind the table. Right, so сидя, from сидеть, that's our verbal adverb. It's imperfective, and it's modifying пили and разговаривали, right, our compound verb there. So again, while sitting. Okay, 2. Выпив чай, они встали из-за стола. Okay, that's from a perfective verb, right? Выпить, right? So that's a perfective verbal adverb. It's modifying the main verb встали over there in the main clause, and we need to use having. Okay, again, the having really here is not optional. Really nothing else would work. Having drunk the tea, or having finished their tea, they got up from behind the table, right? They got up from the table. Okay, number 3, вставая, они положили салфетки на стол. Okay, so the main verb is obviously положили. Our deverbal is вставая, right, which is from the imperfective, вставать, right? I mean, by the way, you can look at the endings here. Obviously, that's a big help with these verbal adverbs, but of course, we should also know our pairs, right? And we know the pair for getting up is вставать, встать. So it's obvious that вставая is from an imperfective verb. So anyway, while getting up, they lay their napkins on the table, right? Вставая modifies положили while getting up. And again, hopefully you see how using that while just makes it very clear what the Russian is saying, right? As they were getting up, right? They lay their, while or as they were getting up, they lay their napkins on the table, right? It's very easy to visualize exactly what the Russian is saying there. Okay, so let's look at a quick painting here. За чайным столом, right, at the tea table, literally behind the tea table, having tea. Они сидят вокруг самовара и пьют чай, разговаривая. Right, they're sitting around the samovar and drinking tea, conversing, or while conversing, while chatting. Okay, how do we form imperfectives? So again, these are the imperfectives, right? Of course, we would only form these from imperfective verbs like читать, строить. Okay, so as we'll see with most of these deverbals, they're pretty easy to form. We just have to watch out for a couple of little weird exceptions or whatever. Let's take the third plural and get rid of the ending, right? Читают, строят, говорят. We drop the ют, ят, ят, right? We drop that ending and we add ya. Okay, so pretty easy. the stress will usually just follow the infinitive more or less. But if we want to be really careful, there are some cases where we might have to think of the ya form specifically. Okay, so there's that, and again, stress will be an issue for a lot of these deverbals. So we'll usually have a separate column here in these tables just to tell us where's the stress going to fall, right? In all likelihood. Okay, so anyway, we basically just add ya and we're done. Chitaya, stroya, gvarya, right? Now look at iskать. Sometimes, because of the 8-letter spelling rule, we would normally try to write ya, but the 8-letter rule tells us we need to write instead. This is quite unusual. But here's one example. Iskать, right, we get the cluster mutation. Sk mutates to sh. We get ishut, we drop the ending. We might like to add ya, but we can't. We write instead because of the rule, and we get isha, right? Now, reflexive verb, for the most part, right, we're doing the same thing as always. We're simply adding the reflexive particle onto the end of whatever verbal form we're using. Same thing is true here, right? Смеяться, смеются, we drop the yut, we add ya, and because that's a vowel, right, we have a form ending in a vowel, we add simply soft s, and we get смеясь, while laughing. Now, again, there are always going to be a couple of exceptions. A lot of those will involve avai verbs. I want to say for all of these deverbals, unless I'm forgetting something, the avai suffix never collapses, right? So even though in the present tense we would normally get, like in the third plural, prodayut, right? We can't use that third plural, right? Basically, this step-by-step form doesn't work, right? We end up with prodavaya, right? So be on guard using avai verbs with a lot of these different deverbals we'll be looking at. Okay, so let's form a few of these. And again, this is pretty easy, really. Number one, открывать. Okay, if we want to do step by step, the third plural would be открывают, and we get открывая. Мыться. Third plural would be моют. Okay, so that would get моя. That would mean while washing. Okay, here we want to say while bathing or while washing oneself. That would be моясь. Number three, улыбаться. Okay, while smiling. Улыбаются. Our deverbal will be улыбаясь. Четыре, путешествовать. Third plural, путешествуют, right? Путешествуя is our verbal adverb. Вставать, okay, be on guard with that one. It's going to be вставая, right? So the little step-by-step thing doesn't work for that one. Выходить, that would be выходит, and our form is выходя, right? Okay, now there's one where the stress corresponds to the ya form, right? Выходить, выходит, right? It's not the same as it is in the third plural, right? So if we want to be really careful, we need to look at the stress in the ya form, which, by the way, is also usually the stress on the infinitive for a lot of infinitives, like выходить, выхожу, выходя. Anyway, number 7, кричать. Кричат would be the third plural, and our deverbal would be крича, right? Okay, there's one that's affected by the 8-letter spelling rule, right? Even though we might think we need to write ya, we write instead. Number 8, нести. Okay, third plural would be несут. We get неся, right? Okay, let's use a couple in just simple sentences. While traveling around Russia, he collected beer labels. Он собирал пивные этикетки. This is autobiographical. I used to do this back when I first went to Russia. I had a little, all these different beer labels from all over Russia, and I put them in a nice frame, and I think now it's rotting somewhere in my parents' attic. I have no idea where it is. It's probably been thrown in the garbage years ago, unbeknownst to me, right? Yeah, word of warning, if you move out of your parents' place, God willing, right, be sure and take your valuables with you, because then your mom will go on a cleaning spree and your things will disappear, never to be seen again. including your prized collection of beer labels. Okay, and the thing's probably worth $20 now. There's no telling what it's worth, right? I mean, not all that money down the drain. Okay, so while traveling, путешествуя по России. Путешествуя, right? There's our verbal adverb. По России, traveling around Russia. Now, again, we don't have to worry about agreement, right? It doesn't matter what our subject is in the main clause. There's only one form for these verbal adverbs. Okay, my girlfriend fell while exiting the subway car. Моя подруга упала, coming out, exiting, выходя из вагона метро. Выходя из вагона метро. Okay, again, выходя is modifying упала, right? How did she fall? And we don't have to worry about agreement or anything like that. Okay, what about perfective verbal adverbs? Again, these are pretty easy to form. With these, we're basically just going straight from the infinitive from the infinitive in most cases, kind of like with the past tense, right? So from прочитать, let's start with the past tense form. We would get прочитал, right? Or from построить, построил, сказать, сказал. All we need to do is drop the L and add a V, right? Прочитав, построив, сказав. Okay, very easy. Прочитав, построив, сказав. So these are usually pretty easy to spot. Only trick here, and we will see this sometimes with reflexive verbs, they may do something a little bit funny. In this case, they don't simply add v, they add вшись, вшись. Okay, so definitely circle that. So for example, встретиться, we would get встретился, right? We drop the L, and we add not simply v, but вшись, and we get встретившись. Okay, so that would work for any reflexive verb. Okay, so what about some forms that are somewhat exceptional, right? Let's take verbs like принести. What if we took that verb and we followed the steps we just learned, right? Starting with the past tense. Well, принес would be our masculine past tense, which doesn't have an L, right? So it's pretty obvious if you go through the steps that we can't apply those same rules. So essentially, verbs like that, we're going to form their perfective verbal adverb in exactly the same way we learned to form the imperfectives just a moment ago, right? So that means we would start with the third plural, right? Not the past, but the third plural conjugated form, like принесут, войдут, выйдут, and then add ya, right? So you see, if you look at this table, it's this exact same we were using earlier for the imperfectives. And we would get forms like принеся, войдя, выйдя. Okay, so that maybe is the most confusing thing about today's lesson, right? That some of these perfectives look like, or they look a lot like the imperfectives. Now again, that's why we can always fall back on simply knowing the pairs, right? Принеся is obviously not from приносить, it's from принести. Right, so as long as we know the pairs, there should really be no difficulty spotting this. Same thing with войдя, right? It's obviously not from входить, right? It's obviously perfective. And so that will help us know to translate these using having brought, having walked in, having walked out. Now here's a really important thing to note as we go forward to literature. Historically, and sometimes even today in more recent literature, you'll see this, some forms that perfective verbal adverbs will also be constructed using the system we just learned for forming imperfectives. So, for example, you may see from the verb встретиться, which means to meet or to meet up, right? You may see встретись instead of встретившись, right? Okay, so that's just something to kind of watch out for passively. You would never form them actively in that way, right? You'd use the rules we've given here, which are more standard nowadays. And again, the fallback there is always to knowledge of the aspectual pairs. If we see a form встретись, the form itself may suggest an imperfective verbal adverb, but we know that it's not from встречаться, it's from встретиться, it's from the perfective infinitive. And so we would translate встретись as having met up with someone, right? So we'll have to watch out for those forms as we read literature. Okay, let's create a few of these, and we'll see again in practice. These are usually quite easy. Открыть, past tense would be открыл, We drop the L, we get открыв. Открыв, having opened. Вернуться, okay, reflexive, so we've got to add вшись. We would get вернул, right, drop the L, add вшись, and we get вернувшись, having returned. Приготовить, приготовив, right, приготовив, having prepared, having cooked. Четыре, перейдя, okay, past tense would be перешел. Okay, now that one does have an L, by the way. These ET verbs do have L in the past tense, but we know that past tense is irregular, right? And by the way, we'll notice again with a lot of these different deverbals that verbs in ET, right, including prefixed forms of ET, are all going to act a little bit oddly, right? Which stands to reason because we know that ET is a weird verb to start with. So this would be перейдя, having walked across. Number 5, встать, that would be встав, having gotten up. 6, перевести, okay, past tense would be перевел. And again, that's a bit of a weird verb. It does have an L, but it is one of those obstruents, right, that generally don't have an L in the past tense, in the masculine at least. Okay, so we're going to apply the imperfective rules for this, and we would get переведут, переведя, having transferred, having translated, having led across. 7, крикнуть, крикнул, крикнув, right, having shouted. And finally, 8, войти, another ET verb, that would be войдя, having walked in, having entered. Okay, let's use a couple in sentences. Having crossed the street, they walked into the store. Перейдя улицу, right, having crossed the street, so перейдя is perfective, it modifies here вошли, right, how did they enter the store? Well, having crossed the street, they entered the store. Number 2, having returned home from the theater, he took off his coat. Okay, let's use вернуться, вернувшись из театра, right? Having returned home from, откуда, из театра, он снял пальто. Okay, so вернувшись modifies the verb снял. Now again, with all these forms we've made today, just remember they're adverbs. We know that like any adverb in Russian, they will never change their form. That means we don't have to worry, about is this masculine, is it feminine, is it singular, is it plural, right? None of that, what case are we dealing with, right? None of that applies whatsoever because these forms are simply modifying a verb. Okay, so today's lesson was pretty cut and dried. And by the way, that does it for verbal adverbs. There aren't any more, right? Only the 2. Okay, so it works out very nicely for any pair. You get one imperfective, one perfective. And, generally they're pretty easy to form. Okay, so that does it for today. Next lesson, we'll start our coverage of verbal adjectives, of which there are a greater number, right? So the picture will be somewhat more complicated with these verbal adjectives, and we'll start that on day 124. Until then, до свидания.